The evening Lord Gervase Crale, Viscount Crale, discovered that the most celebrated work of natural history published in England a decade had been produced by his own betrothed, the woman he had packed off to his country house 16 months prior to learn how to enter a room properly. He was standing at the elbow of Sir Bertrand Foss, President of the Royal Society of Natural Philosophy, at that gentleman's annual winter dinner, holding a glass of claret he had entirely forgotten to drink. "Extraordinary work," Sir Bertrand was saying, turning the illustrated plate toward the candlelight with the reverence a man usually reserves for scripture. "Extraordinary! The precision of the line, the accuracy of the color. I have had letters from Göttingen, from Uppsala, from Paris, mind you, which does not compliment English science on principle, all saying the same thing, that whoever produced the Thorne plates has given the naturalist world the definitive record of British wildflowers. We shall be teaching from these for 50 years. He tapped the plate with one blunt finger. "The King's own physician has requested a personal copy. The Hudson's Bay Botanical Survey is reordering a second set for the new territories, and done the delightful possibility of it all. Refuses to come to London, refuses entirely, receives correspondence by letter only from somewhere in the countryside, Nottinghamshire or perhaps further north." Sir Bertrand shook his head in cheerful bewilderment. "V.M. Thorne, remarkable woman. Do you know her work, Lord Crale?" Lord Crale set down his claret. He knew her work. He knew her handwriting, which was small and precise, and the faint smell of cedar oil that clung to her correspondence, and the fact that she kept her drawing materials in a worn leather roll her father had given her. He knew that she was not, by the measure of the drawing rooms he frequented, what anyone would call a fashionable young woman. He knew that she had ink stains on the outer edge of her right hand, which her gloves did not quite conceal. What he had not known, standing in the doorway of her aunt's parlour 17 months ago and cataloguing all the ways she would not do, was that V.M. Thorne, Violet, Margaret Thorne, his own betrothed since the arrangement made between their fathers 12 years before, was the finest natural history illustrator in the English-speaking world. He had not known it because he had never asked. "And I am going to stop us here, at this dinner, with the claret untouched and Sir Bertrand still talking, and Lord Crale understanding in the particular cold light that only public humiliation can produce exactly what he had done, because before I tell you what was in the letter, and what Violet Thorne made of it in the 16 months that followed, you and I have a small arrangement to attend to first. Find the subscribe. It takes a moment, it costs you nothing, and it means the next story finds you the instant I have it ready. I never run short. I only run ahead of the people who have not pressed the button yet. Press it, then come back to me. Because what this woman built in the country while the man she was promised to attended London dinners is worth every minute of the telling. Now come back with me those 16 months. The betrothal between Lord Gervase Crale and the late Mr. Thorne's only daughter had been arranged in the old way by two men who trusted each other more than they trusted the future. Mr. Thorne, naturalist, lecturer, respected and perpetually underfunded, had been the elder Viscount's closest friend since their university days, the sort of friendship that survives distance and disagreement, and the particular strain of one man becoming very grand while the other remains very learned. When Mr. Thorne's health failed and his affairs were found to be, like most naturalists' affairs, in a condition more interesting than solvent, the elder Lord Crale had settled the debts quietly and asked in return only the old promise that their children would honour the connection when they came of age. Violet had been 14. Gervase had been 18 and away at school. Neither had been consulted. By the time Violet's father died, she was 25, and it was a Tuesday in November, and she had sat with him through the night cataloguing his notes because he had asked her to, and she would have done anything he asked. She was left with a small income, her father's library, his unfinished manuscript, and the knowledge that somewhere to the north a viscount she had met perhaps 5 times in her life, was legally her future. I must be honest with you about what Lord Crale was, because he matters more than his title suggests, and because his failing was one of the most ordinary kind, the kind that decent people fall into every day without once recognizing it as a failing at all. He was not a cruel man. He was a careful one. He had inherited, very young, a name that carried weight, and a terror of having the world find him wanting, and he had responded by becoming flawless in exactly the ways that show. His estate was managed well. His accounts were exact. His conversation was considered, his dress impeccable, his manners the kind that required no effort, because they had long since hardened into reflex. He had built a life designed to withstand scrutiny. And then the trustees reminded him of the promise, and he went north to meet the woman attached to it, and he was afraid before he even arrived. He told himself he was not. He told himself it was only prudence that kept him watching her across the parlor, her practical grey gown, her ink-stained hand, the way she spoke directly rather than obliquely, as women in his circle had learned to do, cataloguing, with the efficiency of a man who had learned to read rooms, all the ways Lady Honoria Sedge and her circle would find her wanting. Lady Honoria, the sharpest tongue in his set, who had once reduced a cabinet minister's wife to tears at a card table simply by admiring her brooch with precisely the wrong inflection. He had been present the one time Lady Honoria had addressed the question of his betrothed directly. 2 years prior, at a supper, she had looked at him across the remove with that particular smile, the one that glittered like frost on iron, and said, "Is it true you are promised to a professor's daughter, Lord Crale? How intellectually improving for you. Does she press her own specimens? You must bring her to the Fossaway exhibition. We shall all be most educated." The table had laughed. He had laughed. And something in him had quietly resolved, he told himself then, and for 2 years after, that it was protection, that Lady Honoria Sedge would never be given Violet Thorne to be educated by. He spent 3 days in her aunt's parlour, being perfectly agreeable, and asking not a single question that mattered. Violet, for her part, watched him with her father's patience, the patience of someone accustomed to observing things slowly and completely, and understood without bitterness that the man behind the careful manners was afraid of something, and that the something was her. There was 1 hour, the afternoon of the 2nd day, when rain came in suddenly, and they were left alone for 40 minutes, while her aunt fetched tea, and he stood at the window talking about his land in a different voice altogether. Not the managed voice, but a lower one, rougher at the edges, about a stand of old-growth oak his bailiff wanted logged, and he could not bring himself to approve. And why? Violet listened to that voice and thought, quietly, that there was a man in there worth the promise their fathers had made. And then her aunt returned, and the managed voice came back, and 2 weeks later, from London, came the letter. She would have read it once and formed her opinion. Instead, she read it twice, because her father had taught her that a document rewards a second reading, and on the second reading, she saw its architecture clearly. It was generous on the surface. It spoke warmly of their meeting. It professed the highest regard for the connection and the deepest respect for her person. And then it explained, in sentences he had drafted carefully, she could tell they were drafted. The rhythm was too even, that London was a demanding world, and it would be unjust, that was his word, unjust to place her within its demands before she had had time to prepare, and that he had therefore arranged for her to remove to Barrowfield, his secondary estate in the north, where she would have every comfort, an allowance suited to her future station, and the company of a Mrs. Ida Paget, a widow of excellent standing and wide experience, who would serve as companion and guide. The purpose of this arrangement, he wrote, and this was the sentence, my dear friends, that she read standing at her aunt's kitchen table and would carry the rest of her life, was so that she might have time to cultivate, in ease and at her own pace, the graces that the world would expect of the Viscountess of Crale. Read it quickly, in the voice he wrote it in, and it sounds like a kindness. Read it twice, the way Violet read it, with the eye of a woman who had spent her life describing things precisely, a woman who knew the difference between what a flower appears to be and what it actually is, and it says something different. It says, "You are not fit to be seen beside me. I am storing you in the country like a piece of furniture that does not suit the drawing room, and I have hired someone to sand you into a shape that will, and I have not the courage to say so plainly, so I have dressed it as a gift, and I expect gratitude." Her aunt stood in the doorway, watching. She reported later, and she told this story to the end of her days, whenever anyone asked her what Violet Thorne was made of, that her niece read the letter twice, set it down, was still for the length of time it takes a candle to drip once, and then said, very quietly, looking at nothing in particular, "He has sent me to be refined. Like ore." Then she picked up her father's unfinished manuscript from the corner of the table where it had sat for 3 weeks, and she began to make a list. Because here is what Lord Gervase Crale did not know about the woman he was parking in his spare house to be improved. He had just delivered the finest natural history illustrator in England to an empty estate with a generous allowance, a working library, unlimited northern light and instructions, his own instructions, to occupy herself with the matter of becoming more accomplished, and the accomplishment Violet Thorne had been developing since she could hold a pencil was the completion of her father's 30-year project. A comprehensive illustrated record of every wildflower native to the British Isles, drafted for accuracy rather than decoration, indexed for use rather than display, and built to last. She arrived at Barrowfield in the first week of November and found it exactly what he had promised, large, orderly, and empty, and found Mrs. Ida Paget, the hired refiner, to be a genuine surprise. I want to give you Mrs. Paget properly, because she becomes the hinge the whole story turns upon, and she deserves better than a footnote. Ida Paget was a widow of 53, who had spent 25 years in the book trade. First as the daughter of a London printer, then as the wife of one, then as the quiet manager of that printing house after her husband's death, until her husband's brother had arrived from Edinburgh and taken the business, politely but completely, in the way such things are done when a widow has no male advocate and the law is not particularly interested in inconveniences of that sort. She had accepted Lord Crale's commission, companion and guide for my betrothed, who requires some finishing, partly for the income and partly, she told Violet later, out of curiosity. She had expected a sulky, self-conscious young woman who needed to be talked through which gloves wore to which occasion. What she found on the evening of her 3rd day at Barrowfield was her charge seated at the north-facing library table she had commandeered and relit with 4 extra lamps, working on an illustration of a common dog Violet, with a discipline and economy of line that made Mrs. Paget stand in the doorway for a full minute before announcing herself. The finished plates, already completed, were stacked to the left in a cedar case. There were 47 of them. "May I see?" said Mrs. Paget. Violet handed her the nearest one, without looking up. Mrs. Paget looked at it for rather a long time. Then she sat down in the chair nearest the table and said, "Your father's project?" "His drawings, his notes, his taxonomy, my hand, my corrections, and 312 plates still to go." Violet set down her pen. "He spent 30 years on it. He died before the illustrations were complete. The manuscript without the illustrations is a set of directions with no map. And with them." "With them," said Violet, "it is the most complete and accurate field reference for British wildflowers produced in this century. Every apothecary, every physician, every botanical garden and agricultural college, and curious person who has ever looked at a hedgerow and wanted to know its name." She looked at the stack of finished plates with the directness that was. Mrs. Paget was already learning, simply how she looked at everything. "He worked his whole life for this. I intend to finish it." Mrs. Paget, who had spent 25 years in the printing trade and understood both what such a work was worth and why most such works by women never reached a printer's hands, made the decision that earns her a place in this story. She said, "Then let us also discuss how to publish it properly, because talent without a printer is a letter that never arrives, and I know every printer in London." That first winter at Barrowfield, they established their terms. Violet would complete the plates. She worked 6 hours a day, more when the Northern Light was good. Mrs. Paget would handle all correspondence with printers, negotiate the contract, and ensure the work went into the world under the name it deserved. There was one condition which Mrs. Paget insisted upon, and over which Violet made only one objection before conceding. The work would be published under her full name, not by a lady, not compiled from the notes of the late Mr. Thorne, not any of the customary arrangements by which women's work reached the public without their names attached. V.M. Thorne, said Mrs. Paget, every plate, the title page, the index, the correspondence, you will not disappear into this book, the book will carry you. By the end of the second winter, the first volume of the Thorne plates was in press. By spring, it had sold its first printing to apothecaries and agricultural colleges before the ink was dry. By summer, the second printing had been ordered, and letters were arriving from universities in Edinburgh, Dublin, and Halifax, Nova Scotia. A botanical society there had ordered 12 sets for their members, and from the Royal Horticultural Society, and from a physician in Bath who wrote that he had been waiting 30 years for precisely this reference, and was Violet Thorne by any chance available to consult on a second volume. She was not available. She was at her table completing the third. She did not come to London. She received inquiries and commissions and congratulations by letter from Barrowfield in the Northern Light that she had come to love, and she declined every invitation to appear in person with the pleasant finality of someone who has somewhere better to be. The name V.M. Thorne, precise, plain, a little like the flowers she drew, became, in the parlours of the learned, and then in the parlours of the fashionable, who always follow the learned once the learned are sufficiently admired, the subject that displaced all others. Which brings us back to Sir Bertrand Foss's dinner table, and a viscount, with untouched claret and the specific sensation of the floor becoming unreliable. He went north the following morning. He did not sleep the night between. He sat in his London study and reread the letter he had sent her. He had kept a copy, because he kept copies of everything, because a man afraid of the world keeps receipts, and read it this time without the audience of his own approval, and understood, somewhere between the second and third reading, that he had done something he could not polish away. He had looked at the finest eye in England and called it unfinished. Barrowfield met him like a correction. He had left it orderly and quiet and slightly sad, the way houses are sad when no one is actually living in them. He arrived to find it working. The North Library wing was lit from the inside at midday, warm with purpose. The housekeeper moved with the particular efficiency of someone whose household has genuine meaning. There were crates at the door bearing the name of a London printer, and a young woman from the village was carrying correspondence to the post road, with the unhurried confidence of someone performing an essential function. Lord Crale stood in the hall of his own house and understood, with a clarity that was not comfortable, that he was the visitor here. She was at her table, finishing a plate. He could see the clean lines of it from the doorway, a flower he could not name, drawn with the precision of love and patience combined, and Mrs. Paget was reading from a letter beside her. Neither had heard him enter. It was Mrs. Paget who looked up first. The room stilled. Violet set down her pen and turned, and he saw her exactly as she had been in her aunt's parlour 17 months ago, and entirely differently, because the difference had never been in her. It had been in his eyes. He saw her now, the bearing, the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why, and the look she gave him across her own workroom, not triumphant, not cold, but watchful in the way of someone who has learned not to decide quickly about things that matter. Lord Crale, she said. "You find us in the middle of the day's work. Mrs. Paget, will you take the correspondence through?" I believe the Viscount and I should walk. They walked out into the kitchen garden, because it was the nearest door, and because neither had suggested anywhere grander, and he did the first wise thing he had done in 17 months. He spoke first, and he did not prepare what he said. "I have not come with an apology rehearsed," he said. "I wrote 3 on the road north and destroyed all of them because they were too well composed, and I have had enough of my own composition, so I will say it plainly, and say it once. The letter I sent you was the most dishonest thing I have ever done, and I knew it was dishonest when I wrote it, and I wrote it anyway because I was afraid of a woman I do not even like, and I let that fear cost you something it had no right to touch. I am not asking you to forgive it. I am not certain forgiveness is the right word for something of that particular kind of cowardice. I am asking only this, whether there is anything a man can do, starting from exactly nothing, to deserve a place in this life." He stopped. They were standing beside a bed of frost-edged rosemary. I walked through that hall and understood that I have never made anything I was proud of. What is in that library? I stood in that doorway and saw it, and it was the worst moment of my life, and it should have been. Violet walked for a time without answering. The garden was very quiet. When she spoke, her voice was the same as it had always been. Even, low, saying fewer things than most people's and meaning all of them. "I will tell you what your letter gave me," she said. "Because it was a wrong, and I will not otherwise, and I read it twice and felt it properly. And there were nights that first winter when I was not calm about it at all, but it gave me the house and the time, and the allowance and the instruction, that improve yourself, occupy yourself, that I chose to interpret as a commission. My father's work is in the world now. The 3rd volume is nearly done. There are women in Halifax and Edinburgh and Dublin who write to me about the plates, who are using them, who are teaching from them. That work exists because you sent me somewhere quiet with enough resources to finish it, and intended nothing of the kind." She paused. "I cannot hate you clean for that, and I have stopped trying, and it is not the same as trust, and it is not the same as a future. So let me tell you what a future might require." She stopped walking and looked at him directly, with the same precision she brought to everything. "You cannot come back as Viscount Crale gracing my workroom. London is already composing that story, the nobleman's clever betrothed, the Crale collection, the charming footnote. I have had 3 letters this month from people who have already decided that story is true. If I marry you under those terms, I become a footnote in my own life, and the work becomes your consequence rather than mine, and in 10 years no one will remember whose eye it was." She let the words settle. "But I am not finished. You asked what a man can do. Here is what he cannot do. He cannot arrive with a ring and a season and a solution already in hand, and here is what he might try. Come back as no one, not Lord Crale. A man in a workroom who asks what needs doing and does it, on the understanding that what needs doing is often dull and that none of it is about him. Do that through 1 season. Let me see whether the man I heard for 40 minutes at a parlor window, the one who talked about old oaks and couldn't bring himself to cut them, is a man you can be every day. I make no promises. I am not a conclusion to be arrived at, but I could have loved that man. I have thought so for 16 months. I will not marry him until I have seen him hold the weight of a plain day, and I will not marry the other one at all." He came back. "That was the first thing, and I will ask you not to underestimate it. Men like Lord Gervase Crale offered the quick and complicated path instead of the slow plain one, mostly do not choose the slow plain one. He took rooms at the inn in the nearest market town. He declined Barrowfield, the house that was technically his, with an instinct that made even Mrs. Paget, who had been prepared to think poorly of him, set the thought aside provisionally. He presented himself at the North Library door the following morning and asked, with no gloss on it, what needed doing. Violet, without looking up, directed him to the correspondence with the printer, which had become tangled in a question of copyright terms she had not had time to unravel. He sat at the foot of the work table, below the cedar cases and the finished plates, and spent his first day reading contracts. He was, it emerged slowly and to considerable surprise, including his own, genuinely useful at the work that didn't show. He had grown up managing a large estate. Once the performance of himself was set aside, there remained a man who could read a contract with attention and negotiate terms without needing to win more than was fair, and who understood, from his own estate, dealings, how tradesmen were managed and how distribution worked. When a consortium of London booksellers attempted, in the third month, to purchase the plates and the print rights together, meaning to repackage the Thorne work under a more commercial name and price it beyond what a country physician or small agricultural college could afford, it was Gervase who found the approach in the correspondence, and Gervase who spent 6 weeks methodically closing every door it might walk through. He did it, and here is the thing worth noting, not with his title. He used the title once, in a letter to a solicitor, to confirm he was serious. Every other step was Clark's work: 3 alternative contracts, a registered copyright, a deed of trust establishing the plates as the permanent intellectual property of V.M. Thorne alone, with a clause. His own edition, which he drafted and redrafted 4 times before he was satisfied, specifying that the terms of the trust could not be altered or overridden by any future husband of the rights holder. Violet found that clause on a Thursday afternoon in April, reading through the completed documents. She sat with it for a long time. Mrs. Paget, passing the open door, saw her and did not interrupt, and walked the rest of the length of the corridor, wearing an expression she had not worn since the day the first volume came off the press. He stayed through spring and into summer. He learned the name of every person who worked in the library wing and the concerns of every career on the Northern Road. He grew easier in himself in the way a man does when he has stopped performing and started simply being present. The careful finish wore away to something rougher and considerably better, and Violet watched it happen with the patience of her craft. Not hoping it true, but testing it, the way she tested every line of every plate before she committed it to the final sheet. On a morning near the end of August, she set down her pen and said, without looking up, "There is a commission from the Botanical Garden in Montreal that needs a response. They want 12 sets of all 3 volumes and a possibility of a 4th dedicated to North American species. I told them I would consider the North American work. I think I should like to do it. I think I should like to see the country myself." A pause. The response to Montreal is on the right side of the table. He wrote the response. When he had finished, she looked up and considered him for a long moment in the northern light, and what she saw in his face satisfied her, the way a finished plate satisfies when the line is true. "Ask me," she said, plainly no preparation. Gervase Crale asked Violet Thorne to marry him in 10 words, 2 of which he had to repeat, because his voice caught on them, and she looked at this with the attention of a woman who notices everything, and counted it in his favor and said yes. They were married in November, in the small church in the village nearest Barrowfield, and I will give you 3 details, because 3 is what history kept. The first, Violet wore a gown she had made herself from grey wool, practical, well-cut, with no ornament at all, and every woman present agreed afterward, without quite being able to say why, that it was the most elegant thing they had seen at a wedding in many years. The second, the library wing staff and the village printer's apprentices and the postmistress, who had carried 3 years of scientific correspondence to the road, filled the first 4 pews of the church, and the Viscount's London acquaintances, who had expected something grander, found themselves seated behind people they did not recognize and felt, not wrongly, that this was correct. The third, the 4th volume of the Thorne plates, British and North American wildflowers, the only comprehensive cross-Atlantic botanical record of its kind, was dedicated, at the author's insistence, to no one of title or consequence, but simply to every curious person who has ever stood in a field and wanted to know the name of what was growing there, and its some Miss Paget's terms and under Mrs. Paget's pricing, at the cost of a decent meal, every season thereafter, for as long as there were fields and curious people to walk through them. And Lady Honoria Sedge, because you have been wondering about Lady Honoria Sedge since I first mentioned her, and you are right to wonder, for I do not introduce a debt without collecting it, attended the following season's opening of the Royal Horticultural Society's new exhibition hall, considered the event of the year, and she stood for a very long time before the centrepiece of the exhibition, an original illustrated plate, 6 feet by 4, framed in oak, depicting the full life cycle of the British primrose in a detail and beauty that reduced several grown botanists to something very like reverence. She commissioned a copy on the spot, a personal copy for her private library, at the price Violet Thorne set for original work, which was not small. She never knew. For the Viscountess of Crale was gracious in all things, and Mrs. Paget kept the commission books, that her order had been accepted the week it arrived, and the copy executed personally, with particular care, and that when it was finished and wrapped for delivery, the artist had said to Mrs. Paget, trimming the final edge, "I promised myself I would be very kind. If you ask me what this story is truly about, I will tell you it is about 2 different ways of understanding value, and how nearly a man ruined both their lives by confusing them. Refinement in Lord Crale's understanding of the word was a coat put on to face the cold of other people's judgment. It is purchasable. It is also always, in some precise and measurable way, lying about something. The thing Violet Thorne had was different. It was accuracy, the ability to see a thing as it truly is, and set it down truly, without flattery, without apology, without making it into something it is not for someone else's comfort. You cannot buy that quality at any price. You cannot hire someone to install it. But, and here is what I take from this story, what I hope you carry home with you tonight. It can be learned if a person is willing to stop performing long enough to actually look. Lord Crale learned to look. It cost him a summer and his certainty about himself, which is a fair price, I think, for the kind of vision that changes a life. And the woman who taught him never once intended to. She was only, as she had always been, doing her work. If you have been sitting by this fire with me tonight, through that letter and that Northern Library, and the 12 sets ordered from Halifax, and you find you would like a proper seat at the hearth, the membership is just below this video. It is very little, and it means I know who is in the room. I love knowing who is in the room. Subscribe to Moonlight at Bellwood, and come back to me beneath the soft light of the evening star, where every ending is deserved and the best work is always signed with the true name. Good night. And the next time someone calls a person plain or unpolished, or not quite ready for the world, do look again, won't you? The most complete work is sometimes the work that asked for nothing and gave everything, and it is simply waiting, with very great patience, for someone with the sense to read it properly,